guest tonight is Ukrainian war reporter, Colonel of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Vladyslav Seleznyov. Vladislav Dmitrovich, good afternoon.
Greetings to you. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Thank you for your time and for joining us. First question. Trump called the Russian army a paper tiger. Now the Kremlin is clarifying whether they're a tiger or a bear. But right now, let's talk specifically about this paper comparison. In your opinion, to what extent could such a sharp change in rhetoric, and it really is a sharp change in Trump's rhetoric, be connected to the actual situation on the front lines?
It's obvious that, by force of arms alone, the Russian army has managed to capture less than 1% of Ukrainian territory since September 2022. In fact, active combat operations and the involvement of a huge number of Russian soldiers do not fundamentally change the situation on the battlefield. After all, it's clear that 700,000 Russian servicemen are capable of putting pressure on our defenders. But the pace of the enemy's advance in September, for example, is about 8 to 9 square kilometers per day, which is at least half of what it was in August. Of course, the enemy is still trying to take advantage of the same time deadline to carry out at least part of their plans, which they had hoped to achieve during the summer offensive campaign. But even now, it's clear that the enemy doesn't even have a ghost of a chance that in the coming months, or perhaps even within a year, they will be able to fully occupy the entire territory of Donetsk region. In fact, it was for this very mission that, back in February 2022, the large-scale offensive operation of the Russian army began, the one they call a special military operation. So it's obvious that when American leader Donald Trump refers to the Russian Federation as a paper tiger, he's right. In other words, the braggart who puffs himself up and boasts about his strength and power turned out, in reality, to be that very same paper tiger, utterly worthless and incapable of carrying out even a fraction of his plans. And once again, I recall American President Donald Trump. He said, if the American army tried to carry out this mission, they would have completed it in at least a week. Here we see more than 3.5 years of full-scale war. Again, to be fair, we should actually be talking not about 3.5 years of full-scale war, but about more than 11 years of Russian-Ukrainian confrontation, which began back in February or March of 2014. What has Russia managed to accomplish during this time? About 19% of Ukrainian territory was occupied, but the vast majority of these seizures happened as part of Russia's special asymmetric hybrid actions. The lion's share of those territorial seizures took place either in 2014 or at the beginning of 2022. The rest are Russian gains, which amount to just 0.97%. That is exactly how much Ukrainian territory the enemy managed to seize directly during active combat operations.
Well, that's probably a question not for you, but for Donald Trump. Why is it a paper tiger now, and not earlier? But the question is for you. Russian drones are all over Europe right now. Russian planes are flying right over German frigates, just like that. They even fly into Alaska. Maybe Putin forgot his phone there? In your opinion, how should Europe respond to these blatant provocations?
As for the options, whether Putin forgot his phone in Alaska, definitely not. On this matter, I am definitely informed by reliable sources. Putin doesn't use modern electronic gadgets and often relies solely and exclusively on the same wired telephone to carry out certain communications. Moreover, the computers installed in the various bunkers of the Kremlin dictator aren't even connected to the global internet. As for Russian provocations, it's clear that this is a deliberate manipulation, a kind of hybrid aggression aimed at European countries. After all, de facto, in this way the Russian army is carrying out several very important elements. Element 1. They are testing the responsiveness of the North Atlantic Alliance to these provocations. Secondly, they are checking the level of readiness of the European community, as well as the North Atlantic Alliance, to continue tolerating such aggressive hybrid actions by the Russian Federation. And here's the key point. We need to understand that evil which goes unpunished multiplies many times over. And if we are now talking about Putin's Russia as the evil of the modern 21st century, then accordingly, we must realize that Putin will not stop on his own. He will continue to raise the stakes. He will continue to escalate the situation until collective Europe or the North Atlantic Alliance is able to give a decisive response to these provocations. Yes, I understand the concerns of some opponents who say, for example, that the Russian ambassador to France claims that if a Russian plane is shot down somewhere over Europe while carrying out provocative actions, it would be considered an act of war. But hold on a second. Modern history remembers an example when a Russian fighter jet was shot down on Turkish territory. That was around 2015. Did this lead to a confrontation between Turkey, a country that is part of the North Atlantic Alliance, and the Russian Federation? The answer is obvious. No. I think that this time, too, the same paper tiger, the Russian Federation, will, through one of its ambassadors, say things that will never become reality. If only because the Russian Federation simply doesn't have the resources right now to open another theater of war, no matter which part of the European continent we're talking about. Whether it's the Baltic countries, Poland, or even the Scandinavian countries, Putin simply doesn't have the resources to carry out these military objectives, because the vast majority of the Russian army is already engaged in the so-called special military operation on Ukrainian territory.
But please help me understand this issue. So, Putin is currently testing Europe, meaning that Europe is not prepared for a possible direct, no longer hybrid, Russian aggression. Yes or no?
I think that right now, it's very convenient for Europe to turn a blind eye and pretend that nothing has happened. After all, de facto, so far Russian aggressive actions have not led to civilian casualties in Eastern European countries, nor have they resulted in the complete collapse of the functioning of those countries that border the Russian Federation or are targets of hybrid influence from the Russian Federation. In other words, Europe is trying, in a certain way, to buy time in order to have that same time for a serious reconfiguration and activity of its own armed forces and its own defense industrial complex, because it seems that all sensible European politicians understand that when a direct military clash occurs between the Russian Federation's army and the army of the North Atlantic Alliance, it's only a matter of time. The fact that this process is inevitable is a fact. Basically, time and again, humanity goes through the same lesson that it hasn't fully learned. A lesson that humanity went through in the middle of the last century. I mean the processes that preceded the start of World War II, and then the whirlwind of those same processes that took place between September 1939 and, accordingly, September 1945. That's why I think the world is now confidently following that same path, and it's only a matter of time before a major European war begins.
I agree, but what if it depended on you? And today you had to decide what the so-called collective Europe should do. So what would you do urgently, right now, today, to prepare Europe for a possible war with Russia in the shortest possible time?
First of all, I would address my colleagues, the European leaders, urging them to take off their rose-colored glasses and let go of any illusions that the Russian Federation might back down or agree to some kind of compromise solution. No, Putin has rather far-reaching and ambitious plans, and he often repeats this idea himself. Russia is playing the long game. I think that this time it's about Putin dreaming of restoring a kind of USSR 2.0. Here I should remind our younger audience that back in those days, during Moscow's dominance, not only the former countries, the former members of the Soviet Union, were under its control, but also the countries of Eastern Europe. Most of what is now unified Germany, with its capital in Berlin, was also within the zone of serious geopolitical influence from Moscow. So, I think that Putin lives in exactly this paradigm and is trying to use military force to restore the status quo that was destroyed during the events of December 1991. I mean the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yes, I understand. Speaking of challenges, appeals. From November 2014 to 2016, you were the head of the press service of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. How do you assess the work of the Armed Forces press service as of today?
That's a difficult question, and in principle, I understand that I have the right and authority to evaluate the work of my colleagues. But as for the commander-in-chief or the chief of the general staff, perhaps I'm not worthy to judge them. I didn't have that kind of experience in military management at the strategic level. As for the communications of my colleagues, it seems to me that they lack flexibility and responsiveness, and to some extent, effectiveness, especially when it comes to interacting with domestic and foreign media. There is always a demand for information. Turning a blind eye, covering your ears and mouth, and not answering perfectly reasonable questions from journalists. Sure, that approach is possible. But is it rational or effective? No. Silence cannot last in any space. If we stay silent, someone else will speak for us. Of course, that same, one grandma said, option, relying on rumors, can sometimes work as intended. But in that case, are we really the ones controlling the information support for our military's activities? In my opinion, no. So, being informed means being armed. The same point I keep making on air remains extremely relevant. We have to understand that the war is ongoing. The Russian Federation launched a hybrid aggression against us back in 2014, in which the informational component is very powerful. And we have no right to stay silent when there are serious problems, because silence often breeds despair. Despair leads to chaos. And especially now, for us, for our Ukrainian community, it's not worth wasting time on quarrels and misunderstandings, because only united, only together are we strong. Once again, the old saying goes, together, even the toughest challenges are easier to overcome. So, in order for our group to be the strongest, communication must be so effective, so dynamic, so flexible and operational in terms of reactions, so that the enemy has no chance of breaking through our wall.
Amen. Amen. But suppose Putin dies tonight. In your opinion, will anything change for the better in Russia? Is this even possible?
I am not under any illusion that Putin alone and exclusively decides the future fate of the Russian Federation. There is a certain community of people who determine the present and future of the Russian Federation. Putin is, to some extent, a nominee of this community and, to some extent, a public figure. Therefore, to hope that this situation will fundamentally change with Putin's death and that Russia's aggressive actions, not only towards our country, but also towards many European and Central Asian countries, will simply disappear, is probably unrealistic. The key factor that can influence the geopolitical ambitions of the Russian Federation is, after all, the factor of resources. And this is exactly why the civilized world has a reason to unite, because a united stance allows us to strip the Russian Federation of its illusions. The systematic and methodical destruction of defense industrial facilities and oil refining industries in the Russian Federation reduces revenues to the Russian budget, a third of which is consistently allocated to meet the needs of the Russian occupiers. Therefore, only the unification of efforts can lead to a certain economic collapse, and thus drain the offensive potential of the Russian Federation. I think it's not that important what the last name of Putin's successor will be. It is important that the Russian Federation loses any capabilities and opportunities to carry out aggressive actions in the future as well.
Again, I absolutely agree. Thank you very much for this interview, for your time, for your experience, and I hope we'll do this again.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.